Hello, thank you for having me. I wasn't sure I'd be able to make it due to the election which was sprung upon us, but I'm very happy to be here nonetheless, just to really have the chance to talk to you about, I think, how useful the mutual relationship can be between the media and local authorities about bringing to the fore some of the most important issues, in my perspective, that the country is facing at the moment. I won't take up too much of your time with me speaking, because it'd be great to have a bit of engagement back if there's anything useful that I can bring to this session that you'd like to know. So hopefully we'll have time for questions. But I thought I would just start by giving you a very brief insight into what the perception is at the moment of these kind of stories and why we should be telling them, and a little bit about how we make those stories really fly, particularly from a national media perspective. So just a brief bit about me. I started life as a local journalist on a local paper at the Portsmouth Evening News, and my drive for doing that was because I was fascinated by local government. And the reason was I went on a week's work experience at the Chichester Observer, and I was taken along to a district council planning meeting. And there I saw people making representations to this planning committee about issues that really mattered to them. And I know that might have just been a shed in the neighbour's garden that was a bit too tall or an unsightly conservatory over the hedge. But it was the sense that this is where decisions are taken which immediately affects people's lives in the most important way. This is the sharp end of politics where people can engage with their councils on a very direct level. This is kind of democracy in action. And that for me was a really fascinating concept as a journalist. So I started at a local level and have retained that interest in local government and coverage of it ever since, really. I went up to Westminster to join the national political team about 6 or 7 years ago, in that really funny period, if you cast your mind back, between 2010 and 2015, when politically things felt quite normal, comparatively, and we just sort of did normal political coverage with, policies, and, we'd look at them, scrutinise them and report on them. It was insane, and it felt a bit like a different world. And then 2015 happened, and suddenly we all became obsessed with this strange thing called Brexit. And for my sins, I was sort of assigned in the early days as a bit of a Brexit correspondent and went out to Brussels and followed David Cameron around with his renegotiation. And, my life became very consumed by this huge concept of whether we would or would not remain a part of the EU. And then, of course, we had the referendum. And I think for the 12 months or so, perhaps even longer after that initial referendum, the way we did politics changed as the media. Our political coverage, rightly, I think, and by necessity, became absolutely dominated by what was happening in Westminster. And that's because there were crucial political power struggles. There were decisions being taken which were of huge import to the whole country. But it was green bench coverage. It was, you would watch the 6 o'clock news every night, and still now, and, predominantly the top stories on the 6 and 10 o'clock news would be sort of 4 or 5 minute packages of MPs on the green benches discussing whatever they wanted to discuss. And not for a second do I not think that it was right that we did do that. But through that period, I think slowly, there was a growing awareness that actually that is not particularly engaging to an audience who are just trying to crack on with their day-to-day lives. And what we weren't doing from a political perspective, from a Westminster coverage perspective, was making sure that we broadened things out to the issues that really did matter to people beyond that important Westminster day-to-day coverage. We had colleagues that were, Alison Holt, Michael Buchanan, who do social affairs. They did keep it ticking over. But from our Millbank unit, I think we started to grow aware of the fact we needed to do more about the issues that mattered to people on a day-to-day basis. And that was really borne out by the 2017 election, when despite the fact it was an election dominated by Brexit, as I fear this one will be again, we saw the impact of the Conservative social care policy. We saw how that cut through to voters and the difference that may have made to the polls at the end of the day. We saw how people were interested in and listening to Labour policies on things like tuition fees. And I think that was a bit of a wake-up call to some in Westminster to say, while what we are doing is very important, what we are not doing is equally important. And out of that became a focus from Westminster, a role that I took on, which initially was about increasing our coverage of local authorities, coming back to that point about the sharp end of politics and about the decisions that directly affect communities, but also this sense that we wanted to move away from Westminster. So my role now is to go out around the country. I'm based outside of London, although by necessity I do obviously pop into London fairly regularly. But I travel around the UK, and the idea is that we look at the decisions that are being taken in Westminster and how they are borne out across the country, how what is being decided in London is playing out in Norfolk or Sussex or anywhere else, really. And a big part of that is the work of local authorities. So we did a series called Local Matters, which was looking at exactly that. It was about how, particularly, of course, you will know better than I, the funding decisions that were being taken in Westminster, but also the lack of bandwidth to talk about anything else sustainable in the long term in terms of structural decisions around social care was being just sucked up by Brexit. The kind of, the gap that left about how we were going to deal with this huge issue as a country. And we did a whole series of stories with various local authorities. And I think, they went down well and they worked out well. And a big part of the reason for that is what I want to get across to you more than anything else today. The reason for it is two things. Absolutely key to making a story fly on the media is access and people. And that is what we need to tell a compelling story. You all obviously love local government as much as I do, but I'm not sure everybody does. I think at times there is a risk it can potentially be a bit dry. It can potentially seem a bit dull to people that aren't, so engaged as we all are, who don't really understand why it matters so much. And I think part of the job from the media perspective is translating what can often seem complex and difficult decision-making processes, complex funding formula, into stories that matter to people's lives. And that is what we as the media need your help with, really, because you are the guys with the key to the access and the people who can explain why this stuff does really matter. And there is a layer of complexity to this, as you well know. I think, Mrs. Miggins in Portsmouth probably doesn't know who collects her bins or why. Or if you live in a two-tier area elsewhere in Hampshire, you probably might be forgiven for being confused about who pays for your on or off-street parking and who you should phone up when it goes wrong. So cutting through that to the kind of front line of it is what's really essential. I think that obviously means that, there can be risks involved, and there can be difficult subject areas. But some of the most compelling stories that I've told over the course of the last year to 18 months have been when councils have opened up a little bit. So let me give you an example. Around the time of the local government finance settlement last December, I went up to North Yorkshire Council and they opened their doors and let us in to what was a really brilliant service about early intervention and prevention, which was about going into hospital when people are in hospital and putting in support services there to stop them going in to a care home, to get them back into their own homes. They allowed us to go and film in some of these centres. They had set up case studies for us to work with, people that had directly been the recipient of this service. And it wasn't always easy. We had to talk about the service reductions and the cuts there had been and the funding pressures, and their Director of Social Care did us an interview all on that basis. But what it meant was, with that kind of access and engagement and seeing people who are directly affected by the services, we put out a story which I hope they were pretty happy with, which was a sort of fair assessment of the pressure that this local authority was under and why that decision that was being taken in London around the LGFS mattered to that local authority and consequently mattered to the people that depend on their services. It isn't always about social care. Of course, that is the biggest, as you will know better than I, one of the biggest issues politically of the day. It is about other things as well. We don't always have to do stories on social care. Of course, it's about children's services and adult services, but we are not afraid, I'm not afraid, of doing stories about innovative ideas to tackle these kind of difficulties. So with the help of the CCN, actually, I went up to Leicestershire to do a piece about 18 months ago about the concept of moving from a two-tier authority to a large unitary. Rightly or wrongly, obviously it's a controversial idea, not everyone loves it, but we actually did a piece on that on the 6 o'clock news, which, if I'd pitched that to my bosses 2 years ago and said, can I do a piece about reorganisation of local authorities? They'd be like, no. But, I think with the right access, with being able to understand how that works and with being able to understand why that matters to the service delivery on the ground, by identifying case studies, by identifying services that might change as a consequence, and by the local authority helping us with that. So we had access to their refuse collectors. We had access to within the local authority buildings to their office structures, none of which might sound exciting, but when these are the services that people depend on and we can show them and put them on the telly, it suddenly becomes a lot more compelling. I come back to the point about the risk. I mean, I think what Somerset did was really quite extraordinary with Panorama in the way they sort of opened their doors so fully and took the chance on what they put into that process was going to be fairly reflected at the end. It is a huge gamble, and I fully understand that. But what I would say is, from a journalist's perspective, if you can build up a relationship of trust with someone, and this is where people like the CCN media team have actually helped. I've worked through the CCN to get access to local authorities in the past. They can, to some extent, vouch for me. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be difficult questions and difficult conversations, and it doesn't mean that I would ever shy away from asking difficult questions about the decisions that local authority leaders or directors of adult social care have taken. But what it does mean that if you're prepared to sit down and talk about it, if you're prepared to explain it fully to me, the chances are what comes out the tube at the other end is a much fairer, more accurate assessment of what's going on, therefore a much fairer, more accurate assessment of the pressures you're facing that can feed into the national conversation which needs to be had now about the long-term funding of local authorities and the services that are provided. So, yeah, it is risky, but I think building up a relationship in advance, being as open as you feel like you can be, giving us access to the people that depend on the services so we can show their worth, all get stories on the telly. And of course I want stories on the telly because it's my job, but more importantly, I want stories on the telly so that this really vital national conversation about how we sustain, provide the services that so many people depend on so wholly doesn't go away. And particularly when we're in an election campaign. My colleague did a piece last night on the 6 o'clock news about exactly this, the pressure on social care funding. It is all too easy for that kind of thing to be squeezed out or to be put through in sound bites. And it is our responsibility as the media to ensure that doesn't happen, but we do need the help of the people on the front line to do that. So I won't go on any longer, but that is kind of my pitch to you. You know, it works better when we work together to tell the stories. Not, you know, that doesn't mean there's not going to be adequate scrutiny, but it does mean about building a relationship of trust so that what comes out the end shows people why this stuff really matters. And I'm more than happy to take any questions later on, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Morning, everyone. As you can see from the slide, I'm Stephen Chandler. I'm currently the Director of Adult Services in Oxfordshire, but up until September of this year, I've been the Director in Somerset, been there for 3.5 years. Prior to that, I was a director in Shropshire, and I'd had a number of assistant director posts in local government. And before that, I worked in the NHS. So a lot of experience in working in the care sector, as well as working in local government. And I think part of that gave me a level of confidence in going into this piece of work with the BBC that ultimately, I think, resulted in some really powerful stories. Can I just check firstly from the room, who actually saw either the first or second Crisis in Care programme? Okay, good, that's good. Who in the room has had a film crew follow you for 10 months, including in your bedroom? Yeah, no? So who in the room believes that your organisation has some fantastic stories to tell, fantastic people making real differences to local citizens? Yeah, okay. I'll come back to that. So why get involved? We believed that there was a growing challenge in delivering social care in local authorities. That wasn't just the financial challenge, which tends to be pretty well known, but the challenge of meeting people's demands. Everybody talks about the demographic time bomb linked to older people, but for most of us who are working in social care, we know that actually that's become less of an issue, and actually the challenge of meeting working age adults is now much more of an issue. So for us, we felt increasingly concerned about the story that needed to be told. So through ADAS, the Association of the Directors of Adult Social Services, a number of directors were approached. They'd been having conversations with Alison at the BBC around telling this story. And I went back to Somerset and said, there's an opportunity to do some work with the BBC. There are 3 councils, if we were to agree to participate, that would open their doors to the BBC to come in and tell a story of adult social care. This was probably about March 17, March 18. So we were confident at the work we were doing transforming our social care services. We believed we were doing really well, and where we had challenges, they weren't of our doing. David and Pat, leader and chief exec, were supportive of continuing that conversation. So we had a quick conversation with the production company, and that went well. I didn't hear anything more, and then a few months later, Alison rang me up and she said, good news, it's only you. I said, what do you mean it's only us? She said, the other two councils have pulled out. I said, what do you mean they've pulled out? They're worried that the story may not come across the way they want, and it's not the right time for them. So it's just Somerset. But we think Somerset is probably better anyway because of the demographics, etc., etc. I said, God, that's going to be a hard one to sell because it's only us. And she said, yeah, but you can do it. And we've been talking internally, and actually we think this story needs a powerful brand. So it's going to go out under the Panorama umbrella. Shit. It's just us, and it's Panorama. So, David, the leader, is in the front row, and this is probably the first time he's going to hear this. So I came back and I said, good news. We impressed the BBC so much that they've got rid of the two other authorities. They're just working with us, and they think the story's so powerful that they've got the Panorama brand behind us. So, well, that doesn't sound so great. So anyway, the importance of having a confident director and a good story, I think, helped me reassure both the leader and the chief exec that this still was a good story for us to get involved with. Because as local government, we have a responsibility to tell the story, the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly. So, what was the programme like? For those of you who've seen it, there were some really powerful stories.
It's incredibly sad. We thought we'd found the care home from heaven, really, with the support here, the carers here, and we understand the situation. They have to shut the care home.
I won't forget you.
That's okay then, I won't forget you.
I just hope and pray that this is going to be the last change for them.
So the way that the programme was filmed was really, really powerful. It took individual stories and tracked them during the experience of working with the council. And it was filmed, as you see, up close, so you really got to see the person, both physically and their story. And that brought it alive, and there's nothing more powerful than seeing the actual story or issue alive from the eyes of the individual. It did require us developing that relationship that Alex talked about, and it did require us working really hard to maintain that. Whoops. Sorry, Pat, didn't want to miss you. So it was important to get that initial buy-in, but it was also important to keep reassuring as we went through. And I think we would talk about growing confidence. So I remember a really difficult cabinet meeting we were having where we were talking about some of the cuts that we were going to have to make because of the financial position. And clearly we weren't allowing the cameras in, but the cameras could video us as we walked into the meeting. And we had to ask them to go way up the corridor because we weren't prepared to have them outside the door. Later on, that relationship had changed completely because we understood and trusted that this programme was as important to the BBC as it was to us. So it's really important to ensure you've got that CEO and leader involvement. To be honest, there'll always be politics. There'll always be somebody who said, I wouldn't have done that, and it's because of the decision you took that you're in the mess you're in or that. But it's also really important that you keep your staff on board. So some of our staff at the end of 10 months of filming had never seen Panorama or the film crew because they would never let them in. They weren't prepared to have the conversation. They didn't trust them. They didn't think that a positive story would come out of this. Some staff saw over time how it was evolving and became more confident. And there was one manager, a real leader in our service, who was prepared to respect our decision as senior leaders and allow the team in. So Chris Denovan, who featured quite a bit in the programme, is a real leader. Now, she's a team manager, so an important point for us is our leaders are not necessarily the people paid the most or with the most impressive title. Those leaders exist at every level. Don't be afraid of using them. So it was 10 months with Panorama. What was it like? So for some of our staff, as I said, it was, no, we're not doing it. For some, let's see how it goes. For others, let's come in. We introduced the film crew to individuals who we thought would be able to contribute to the program. So it might have been a carer, it might have been an elderly person who was struggling to get funding for a residential placement, etc. Our comms team in the council were absolute stars. They helped us with all of the relationships. So, when HQK ring up and say, somebody's turned up with a film crew, they want to film our interaction, what's this about? They helped with that. I don't know why we've put editorial control on there, because if you think you've got any editorial control, forget it. You have none. You have absolutely none. We signed an agreement at the beginning of this, and we saw the first cut, as we knew it, about 4 days before transmission. And all we had was an opportunity to say, that's factually wrong. We couldn't have said, we don't like the way you've done that. That was the risk, but that was the reward that we considered.
Without the council, we would not have a film. We have had access all areas to senior staff, politicians, social workers, and some of the families that they have been helping. So, to be honest, without the council, we would be nowhere. So I'm eternally grateful for the help and all the support we've been given throughout the 10 months of filming. It has been a privilege.
So how many people in the audience have had a producer say, it's been an absolute privilege to work with your council, and without the council, this story would not have been told? Remember that, because if you don't like what comes off the screen, think about the role you had in playing it. So for us, it was really important to invest significantly in that. So broadcast, and it went out on 2 consecutive Wednesdays. We didn't just wait for it and hope that people would like it. We knew, having seen it, that actually there was 2 ways people could have interpreted the program. They could have said, thank God somebody has really started to tell us and show us what social care is about. Or they could say, what the hell's going on in Somerset? What have they done to the people living there? We clearly didn't want the latter, so for us it was really important that we told the story before people got to see the story. So our comms lead, contacted all of the print media, local, regional, national, all of the broadcasters to say, this program's coming out. Do you want to talk to us about it? Do you want to interview our staff? There was a fantastic article in the MJ and really talked about why the council did that. It was fantastic for 2 reasons. Centre spread, and it was written by the council's press officer. I saw him submit an article, and it was reproduced word for word. So again, don't be surprised if what comes off of the print isn't what you like, if you haven't invested in getting the message across right. So for us, it was a short window to try and help direct the thinking, the experience, and the exposure. And again, journalists really do like it when somebody's prepared to give access, whether it's to a social worker, to a team leader, to a chief exec, to a politician, sometimes even to the director. So we also thought it was important, this was a suggestion from the producers to have a pre-screening to sort of test the temperature as it was. So we had the opportunity to go to Broadcasting House in London. We had Sir Andrew Dilnott and others come along, key leaders from across the sector to watch it and give us their opinion. We invited shed loads of MPs. People we thought had an interest, people we thought that it would be interesting too. And I think we had 2 MPs turn up. Very little. We also wanted to ensure our staff had an opportunity to see it in advance so that they could see what was going on. So again, we did a local screening in the Brewhouse in Taunton.
Very moved.
and I thought it was really powerful filmmaking.
It was a very powerful film. I thought very emotional, really, really emotive.
It was moving, but just angers me really, frustrated.
And I felt very emotional, and I cried almost from the off.
Really, really powerful. How it impacts on the services and the hard decisions that need to be made. Just so gut-wrenching.
I think it really got across the message how well people are cared for.
Really powerful, and it's really hit me here, very much so.
So how was it received? I have to say to you, I had lots and lots of contact. The council had lots of contact. We had 3 messages that could be determined as being negative. Somebody sent me an email saying your problem would be solved if you didn't have a load of non-jobs. You know, went back to him immediately to say, I don't think we have any non-jobs, but if you've got any that you've seen, let me know and I'll look into them. Immediate reply, thanks, I didn't expect a reply. So there's lots of people out there that like to shout at the council, but when you go back positively, thank you for your comment. We had somebody say, the reason you're in it is because you're spending too much money on roads, stop improving the roads in Bridgewater. You know, what? Yeah. So even though I would have said that was a stupid, ignorant comment, went back saying thank you. You know, the budget we get for roads is really important, as it is for that. So engagement is really, really important. You won't necessarily see it on there, but there's a tweet from Matt Hancock. So I think I was on the train going to London to do something, and he did this tweet, and it said, completely agree, last night's Panorama was extremely distressing, and we must do more to support staff. The irony, and probably most people in the room don't know this, he was referring to the Panorama the previous week where Warburton Hall and the learning disability abuse was coming out. For those of you who are on Twitter, you'll probably know that periodically you can measure followers that you've got and lost. And my Twitter feed had come up. In the last week, you've lost 1 follower and gained, 7 more. And somebody tweeted, was that Matt Hancock? So yeah, it's really important to keep pushing these messages. Having had the experience of not getting as much political engagement as we'd hoped and felt was appropriate, we thought, let's go to the House of Commons, let's have a screening there, and we did. Unfortunately, I think we had 3 MPs, so 2 of our local Somerset MPs and the chair of the all-party parliamentary committee. Frustrating, because we thought, let's go to their house. Let's make it easy for them to come along and hear it. It may have just have been because there was an interesting debate on Cornish wrestling going on elsewhere on the estate. But, you've got to keep pushing. You've got to keep pushing. So Alan here, we thought we sent Mark. Mark's our long-suffering comms manager. We sent him out to Alan. Alan has an opinion on everything because we thought we're going to see some MPs. Can you do a message for them? This was Alan's message.
Yeah, to all MPs, I'd say to you this is the one subject in your life that you shouldn't ignore, you shouldn't forget about, to think you can walk away, because it will come back to haunt you. Maybe long after you stop being an MP, when you're elderly, it'll come back to haunt you, and then you've got all the time in the world in your older life to think about how you should have done it.
So I'm going to just quickly run through the last few slides. So all of the evidence, both the soft evidence of people telling us what they thought, reiterated this is a really powerful story that you're doing, but also the hard evidence that the media interest, the context, the Twitter exposure, qualitative and quantitative, suggest that this was a powerful story that was resonating with people. Key lessons: you cannot just leave it to the reporter, to the film crew. You have got to invest in the story. And investing is not saying, yes, we'll do it. Investing is having that day-to-day contact, opening up your door, allowing people in, both physically and metaphorically, being flexible. So if you've seen the program, I'm not wearing a tie because most of you will know. I've been on the telly twice, tying my tie in front of a mirror. You've got to give some, because it helps the film crew tell the story. I remember Mark, again, the long-suffering comms manager, coming storming down the building to me and said, "Do you know what they've bloody well done?" I said, "Oh, who?" He said, "Panorama." I said, "What?" He said, they've gone out with a gritter, not a gritter, a pothole repairer. I said, well, they wanted a broad story. And this was after the government had just announced increased winter pressures money for social care and investment in roads. And of course, the irony was they'd given us £2.5 million for adult social care in Somerset and 10 million for roads. And the producer said to the poor chap who was filling in the pothole, "Do you think it's fair that the government's given this council 10 million for potholes and only 2.5 million for adult social care?" And Mark said to me, he said, "We didn't agree that." I said, "It's Panorama. You don't agree anything with them. You just hope for the best." So yeah, be flexible. Also, push it. Talk to your friends. Tell everybody about what you're doing. Some of the headlines we got all was about bravery. It was about courage. It was about telling a story that wasn't Somerset's, but actually was a national story. If you've been following this, you'll know that David and the team have been really pushing, the stand up for care. Let's address this problem once and for all. Let's help it. Let's use it to lobby. Let's get that wider debate going. Let's use, for us in Somerset at the time, use the positive exposure to help with our recruitment and making the council attractive. Most people will know in the room that Somerset had, during the period of this, some really difficult decisions to take around managing its money. We were in the spotlight quite literally on a daily basis. And what this did was both enhance that spotlight, but also show a broader dynamic. So I think it helped the council at a time where it was having to take some really difficult decisions, show why those difficult decisions were really important if we were going to protect some of the most vulnerable in our society. So I think that's my penultimate slide. But one of the things I would say to you, if you think the narrative in the context of social care is we need more money, it's not going to get you anywhere. There is a question clearly about funding for adult social care, but it is not the sole question. And I worry that we, as leaders in local government, have stopped at the point of we need more money. If somebody said to me today in the context of Oxfordshire, here's 10 million more pounds next year, I wouldn't really know what to do with it. I would know what to do to spend it on some of the things we've been spending it on for now. But I haven't yet got the plans that said, this is good value for money, this is good use of that investment. And I think as a sector, we have really got to move the debate on from it's all about money to being it's about how we will use our investment in the future to meet the needs of those most vulnerable people. Finally, before we take some questions, just to bring home the fragility of the work we do. So you will recall the first programme really powerfully challenged what most people thought of adult social care, because you met Maxine, her husband, and her triplets, this young woman that you wouldn't necessarily have thought a council would be involved in her life. You saw the elderly gentleman who was moving from his care home. You will also saw Paulie, elderly gentleman with learning disability, his niece confront me over her disappointment with our funding decisions around care homes. Since the programme was made, those three people have passed away. Young woman, elderly gentleman, middle-aged man with learning disabilities. So we have an ideal opportunity to make people's lives good, but often for a really short period of time. So it's really important we talk about what impact we have, and we make sure that that impact has maximum impact. Thank you.
Well, we've got time for a few questions, but to just start it off while you gather your thoughts. Question for Alex: what makes a good news story, and what are the elements?
Well, so the thing with news is it's slightly different to the Panorama in that news obviously is it has to have a reason to be on the telly that day. So the most important thing for a news story is a decent peg, as we call it, which is a reason that we're telling this story at this moment. So actually the CCN and the LGA as well are quite good at, when you have new analysis about the pressures that you might be facing in one area or another, pushing that out so we have something new to say about a story that might be ongoing, but it gives us a reason to tell it that day as opposed to any other day. There has to be an element to news to a news story. But beyond that, once you've got your peg, that becomes, in some cases, a really minor part of a much bigger piece. And the absolute key to it, as I said before, is a human face, a human story, and some decent access so we can understand what is really going on with your local authority, with the decisions that you're taking, and with the services that you provide. So whether that's access to directors, to staff, to politicians, to council leaders, but more importantly to service users. And if you can help, often we do this on our own, often we can go off and find case studies fairly simply. But if you know that there is something that you want to get across about a particular service or the way you're providing it, please point us in the direction of people who might be willing to talk about it. I do appreciate these people are often vulnerable, and that makes it really difficult. But from the BBC's perspective, certainly we have very strict editorial guidelines about how we deal with vulnerable people, and we're never going to put anybody in a compromising position. And again, it's going to come down to an element of trust. But if you can at least start that process, and we can have a conversation about it, it can raise a story from being an oeuvre, which is a kind of 15-second read saying new figures have shown X, Y, Z, on to the next one, to a 3-minute compelling package with a human face, which is really going to cut through, we hope, to audiences.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So, Stephen, what would you say to anyone else thinking of opening their doors to a documentary? And what was your favourite and least favourite part of the filming?
So I would say to you, absolutely do it, but think about... But plan for it, but not too much. So what's the story you want to tell? And recognize that your story might be slightly different to the story that the journalist might want to tell, but try and find a way in which both of those stories emerge. So as a little anecdote, so we saw the second film, the second program, and it didn't have the sort of ending that I thought and that we were hoping for. So I was talking to Alison outside, and I said, it doesn't really land the killer message, does it? And she said, yeah, she said, but you won't say what we need you to say. And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, you have never said on film that you recognize that some of the things you've done, well-intentioned and in a belief that they will have a much better outcome for people, are not always appreciated, understood, or valued by people. So there are some people that don't want the change, don't like the change, and are happy with it. And I said, okay. I said, let's go and film that. So we did about half a dozen takes in my lounge, and it wasn't going anywhere. I said, give me the words you need me to say. And she did, and for me, I thought, yeah, I can say that. I said it, and there's a classic. In my view, there's a classic. There's a line in it which clearly, where I accept that some of the things that the council has done has resulted in people losing things that they valued. I may not value it. It may not be valuable to the majority of people, but for those individuals, it was really important. So I was lucky. My family home's in the Midlands, so for the week I was in Somerset. So for lots of the time, it was okay for me to have a film crew, walking around asking me questions, sitting in my lounge saying, "Why are you doing this?" After a while, you forget they're there. They're really fade into the background. But there is a really difficult, for me personally, there were two things. Ismar, who's the cameraman, he was in my kitchen. We were about to go into a really difficult scrutiny meeting on budget proposals. And he kept saying, they'd been saying to me for months, so where is the line that you will not cross? So as a director, where is the point that you say, enough's enough? I can't cut services anymore, I can't save that. And and when Alison's in front of you, you know where she's thinking. Ismail's there with his camera running, and I'm having a bit of toast, and he says to me, he said, "So is today the day? Is this the line that you've reached?" And I said, I don't know whether today is the day. That line is getting closer and closer. I said, but I still wake up, I still go in. And then I thought, shit, I've just said on camera that we are doing things that has professionally pushed me to the edge. How is that going to be perceived? Because it exposed a degree of vulnerability that I didn't think I should have shown, because people don't expect me to do that. Actually, it turned out the opposite. People said, actually, one of the things that was really powerful was, I saw you really cared. That was both from the audience outside, but staff inside. They said, you know, you're constantly on to us about managing money, about managing demand, about doing this. She said, actually, we saw that you really struggle with the challenges just as much as we do as social workers. I won't do this program again. I'm not going to do a negative crisis in care program ever again. I've done it. Sky contacted me in Oxford and said, we'd like to follow up that program. You know, we got Ian Husband as the leader, let's do it. I said, no, I'm not doing that. But I will do another program if I ever get the chance, which is around celebrating the positive impact that local authorities have on vulnerable people.
Yeah, well, it's powerful, that is, Stephen. Alex, you know, in your time as a journalist, what's the most important story you've worked on?
Well, there's a question. As a complete aside and just on a personal level, I actually spent 4 months in Beirut, and I did a story which is not at all appropriate for this format, but the one that I personally felt was crucial was the one about it was Syrian refugees who were having their organs trafficked, and we actually got access to a Syrian refugee who'd sold a kidney and a trafficker who'd done it. So from a personal perspective, it was probably the proudest individual story I'd done in my career, because it shed a light on something that otherwise hadn't been. But I think that translates to every bit of journalism. When you do good journalism, that's what it's meant to be for, is about exactly that. It's shining a light on something that otherwise goes uncovered. And I just think in terms of the conversation we're having now, I mean, I think everybody in this room obviously understands the importance of social care and what it means, but I was just saying to Stephen earlier, unless you've got cause to encounter social care, adult or children's services in your life, for a lot of people that can remain quite an abstract concept. You know, they might hear about social care, but it's not the same as a GP or a dentist. They don't know exactly what it is or what it's for always. You know, unless you've got an elderly relative or, you know, somebody that relies on those services, it doesn't always mean an awful lot, apart from something you hear thrown around between politicians who want a bit more money. And I think a big part of how we cover this story is about trying to explain to people who thankfully haven't had to encounter social services for any reason in their own lives, about why it is so important and why there is every chance that in some part of their life in the longer term they may well rely on those services, and why there has to be a national conversation now. So I would take, you know, the idea of this bringing something to the fore which otherwise isn't fully covered, and just apply it to this really important story which is going to carry on, you know, for some time. And I think I also just said to Stephen, in terms of the risk, I mean, if you go, you quite often see doctors willing to talk about the pressure in A&E, but it's harder to find people who are willing to talk as openly and honestly about the pressure in social care or in local authority services. And I think more and more people are, and I thank everyone that I've interviewed in this room, who I think are a few, about that, and who have been quite honest. But it is that honesty which will help tell the story in the most direct way that people will be able to relate to. And there is a risk to it, and I think the risk is greater in news than it is in Panorama, because you had a much longer period to build up that relationship. In news, quite often we'll jot in on the day, we'll want to do an interview with you, we'll demand access to all sorts of vulnerable people and services, and then you just have to trust that what comes on the 6 o'clock news at night isn't some god-awful car crash of a piece which is going to make your local authority look terrible. And I understand that's a really big ask, but the more honest you can be, the more open you can be, and the more that you can explain to us what you are dealing with, the better the end product will be, because then we will understand.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Alex.